Did that one-handed today. Must be something special on the horizon. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I have a headache today, and my cat just recently had surgery, and she's on kitty drugs right now, kind of wandering around my apartment and needs particular supervision. So I felt like it was no better time than today to actually sit down and film my video talking about season 1 of How I Met Your Father. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, Megan, this show has been out for like over a year now, and the second season is currently releasing episodes on Hulu. Why the hell do I care about the first season of How I Met Your Father? I remember watching the first couple episodes of How I Met Your Father with some of my friends right when it was getting released, at sometime last year. I think we made it through like the third or fourth episode, and we all just kind of were like, you know what? This isn't it. I don't remember the show being particularly funny or good. I just remember finding it to be very cringy, to be honest with you, and I just didn't really resonate with any of the humor or any of the characters in the series. So I just kind of was like, okay, that's done. Time to move on with my life. And so I did. So I continued on with my life, not really thinking about How I Met Your Father at all until I released my That 90s Show trailer reaction video and my That 90s Show series review. And I noticed a couple people in the comments for both of those videos make comments like, well, at least the show wasn't as bad as How I Met Your Father, or at least it doesn't look as bad as How I Met Your Father. And I actually, after releasing both of my videos, went and watched some other people's reviews of That 90s Show just to see what they had to say. And people were making similar comments in their comment section as well. But it seemed like, based on what other people were saying about How I Met Your Father, that it didn't really get better after the episodes where I stopped watching. It seemed like the general consensus was that people didn't really like it that much. Then I saw that it was getting a second season on Hulu, and I was kind of confused, like, okay, well, I remember not liking this show. Seems like nobody else really likes this show. Why the hell is it getting a second season? It kind of piqued my curiosity a little bit, and especially after watching a show that a lot of people were making comparisons to and doing a video on that, I thought it might be an interesting idea to go back and rewatch How I Met Your Father and see if my opinion changed about it at all, and see if I can get an understanding of why it was renewed for a second season. Now, my initial plan was to just wait until season 2 finished airing all of its episodes and then doing one big analysis for the series thus far. But then I saw that it was going to have 20 episodes in season 2, and that seemed like a lot of content to cover in one single video, so I decided it would probably be a better idea to cover the first season, kind of get a basic understanding of what's going on and seeing how this first season establishes the story. Once season 2 wraps up, go back to that and then cover the second season in its entirety and see if it got better or worse from the first installment. That's what we're going to be doing today. Spoiler alert! Spoiler! Spoiler! If you have not seen season 1 of How I Met Your Father, or if you have not seen How I Met Your Mother in its entirety, and without further ado, let's get started. So before we do anything else, we should probably talk a little bit about How I Met Your Mother. How I Met Your Mother was a sitcom series that ran from 2005 to 2013 and centered around the story of protagonist, architect, hopeless romantic, and overly idealistic Ted Mosby telling the story to his future children in the year 2030 about how he met their mother. The series essentially is supposed to be part of Ted's extremely long-winded story to his kids about meeting their mom, and each episode contributes to the part of the story. How I Met Your Mother is kind of like That 70s Show in that it's absolutely beloved by fans for its amazing character chemistry, balance of realistic and grounded character arc mixed with silly over-the-top gags, and a final season that we don't really like to talk about all that much. For a long time, How I Met Your Mother was one of the most popular and beloved sitcoms on television, in large part because of its iconic characters, but also because of the narrative drive of the story. It was so well known to many fans that the writers had a plan from the beginning of how the story was going to play out, and the more you watched, the more you were interested in finding out who Ted's future wife would be. This formula was kind of also genius for a sitcom, which as a genre usually relies on a storyline that functions purely to showcase its funny characters and resolves itself by the end of an episode, because with How I Met Your Mother, the narrative for the story kind of makes each episode very important. No, not every single episode is critical to the overall story, but a lot of them are, and it makes the show very rewarding to watch the more you binge it. That being said, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the last season of How I Met Your Mother, in particular, the final episode, because for a show that was as widely loved as How I Met Your Mother was, the finale has got to be up there for one of the most disliked and disappointing endings to a series ever. And that's especially devastating considering the amount of time and energy people had invested in this series and following Ted on this story. Without getting too much into the weeds here, the finale revealed some of the major drawbacks of planning an entire 9-season sitcom series from its inception without allowing yourself a lot of room to get critical changes made if necessary. The writers essentially banked on a particular resolution to the story that at some point in the narrative, maybe in about season 5 or season 6, started to not make that much sense anymore, but because the story couldn't course correct or do anything different because it had it planned out from season 1. It had to go all in and commit to this fate that it chose from the start, a fate that probably didn't make that much sense anymore. And unfortunately, people just didn't like it at all. But even with the season finale being pretty disappointing, I still think How I Met Your Mother is a great show. There's an incredible balance of heartwarming, heartbreaking, rewarding, infuriating, and absolutely hilarious moments that really makes this feel like a story about meeting the future love of someone's life. Okay, how do I describe How I Met Your Father? I don't know. If I had to describe How I Met Your Father as like a color, it would probably be like the color beige, you know, or like a muted taupe. It's not like the most objectively offensive and ugly and terrible color in the world, but it's also like not one that you would pick out of a lineup of colors if you had the option to choose. It's not one that like makes you have an opinion about it, really. It's just kind of there. The show is so strange to me because on the one hand, there's nothing objectively wrong with it. It's not like it takes this really polarizing take about something, but the way that it is so adamant about just being so safe and familiar and boring and predictable that it just, that kind of becomes everything wrong with it because there's really nothing to the show. There's nothing different or creative or interesting about it. And it's not like every show has to be like trailblazing with how innovative it is when it puts the show together, but there has to be something about it, something that makes you feel like there's a purpose for why it's being made. And there really isn't anything about this show that makes me feel that way. There's nothing that really like hooks you in. You're just kind of waiting for that moment to come, and it never really does. That moment where you're like, ah, yeah, this is why we're here. This is the thing that's going to like make me gravitate towards this series, and it never really comes. The show definitely follows many of the same story beats as its predecessor does, but it does it in such a predictable and watered down way that it takes a concept from a series that was previously considered to be pretty innovative and creative and ambitious with how it puts together this narrative, and it makes it feel tired and boring and like it's been done already. It just makes it feel lifeless almost. The characters in this series are pretty weak, I would say, in the first season. They definitely get a little bit better as the series progresses, but overall it's kind of difficult to relate to the characters or really get to know them. There's definitely some effort put more towards some of the characters than others. There are some characters that are part of the main cast that definitely feel like they exist for no other reason than to like facilitate a C story in the plot. I do think that the cast is pretty good. Like I think that you definitely can tell that they're trying very hard to add some charm and charisma to these roles, even if the writing is pretty underdeveloped for the characters. And I think that definitely helps to a certain extent, and some of the characters do have a little bit of chemistry that develops as the series progresses, some acting chemistry between certain people. But then there's other people that you feel like there's nothing between them. There's no chemistry. There's no dynamic that would make you think that they would be friends. I do think that there are some opportunities in season 2 to correct some of these things and allow more time for these characters and some of these storylines to pan out in a more interesting way. I also think, kind of like that 90s show, this series as well gets a little bit in its own way with sticking to certain aspects of the original source material to the point where it's not a strength of the series anymore. It's more of a fault. There were certain references made to How I Met Your Mother that kind of blew my mind, but not in a great way. Just in and like, I cannot fucking believe that they tried to shoehorn that into this series, and it just really became distracting instead of exciting to see those things referenced in this show when it tried to do its own thing and tried to divert a little bit from the original source material. I think that's where How I Met Your Father would be at its best, but we didn't see a lot of that. So I think if we got to see a little bit more creativity and a little bit more branching out on its own in season 2, that would be for the show's benefit. I'm so tired. So the plot of How I Met Your Father essentially follows a similar format to How I Met Your Mother. Sophie Tompkins, our main character, is telling a story to her son in the year 2050 of how she met her son's father over some sort of futuristic Zoom call that I'm sure we're not going to know about until the 2050s. And essentially similar to How I Met Your Mother, the entire story of how Sophie met her baby daddy consists of the entire series of How I Met Your Father. There are a couple key differences between How I Met Your Mother and How I Met Your Father. For one, we find out at the end of the pilot episode that at some point during the night where the pilot episode took place, Sophie already actually met the father of her child, and we don't know if it's like just from a random encounter she like bumped into somebody on the subway and didn't know who they were, or maybe it's one of the main characters. We're not entirely sure yet, but we do find out that she did at some point that night encounter her future father of her child. And another key difference is the fact that we don't actually get to see what Sophie's son looks like. We only see her in the future, whereas in How I Met Your Mother we saw Ted's kids, but we didn't see Ted. We only just heard the voiceover from Bob Bob Saget. And I think that was kind of an interesting and intelligent choice on the part of the How I Met Your Father writers, because in How I Met Your Mother, the fact that the kids were a certain age and they just kind of shot different footage of them listening to this story all from season 1 and then used it throughout the 9 seasons because the kids are going to get older eventually. They also had to shoot a reaction to them finding out the end of the story all the way in the first season because they had this planned out for 9 years. And because they had to shoot that reaction right at the beginning of the series, that kind of pigeonholed the writers in a sense where they couldn't divert from this plan they had from the first season because they had this footage that they needed to use at the end of the series. By not seeing Sophie's son and just hearing his voice, it would be a lot easier for the writers to kind of change directions if they decided that something needed to change. And they could do that because all you can hear is his voice. You don't actually see him and you don't have to worry about collecting footage of him reacting to the resolution of the story right from the beginning. I think it was also to hide the identity of the father a little bit better because, you know, depending on what the kid looks like, it could very well give an indication of who the father could be or not be. In terms of the overall narrative for what's going on and how well each individual episode contributes to the overall story of how Sophie met the father of her child, it's kind of too early to tell at this point whether they're effectively working towards that end goal. I mean, we've only seen 10 episodes. It seems like the episodes are kind of contributing a little bit towards that goal. I mean, it's, like I said, too hard to tell. I think we'll probably get a better indication of that in season 2. But I will say at this point, it's not like I'm getting the sense that they're just wasting time. I don't get an indication that they're not contributing to that goal. So I guess we'll have to see. It seems like a lot of the focus, especially in the first 2/3 of this season, were focused on the characters and the relationships, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I do like that the show kind of takes an approach on what it looks like to be in the dating sphere in our 2022 era of living. It is also a little bit redundant at times. It feels like you're just seeing different variations of the same story over and over and over again. And I wish that there was a little bit more diversity for what we get to see these characters do. I do like when the episodes divert a little bit and we get to see more about their work situations and what other dynamics are at play or other things other than their dating lives. I think it's also appropriate now to talk about the humor in the show because oh my god, the humor for this series was pretty rough. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. Now, full disclaimer, like I mentioned in my That 90s Show video, humor is subjective. It's something that is a matter of opinion. There are some things that I find to be hilarious that other people don't, and vice versa. For example, I find myself personally to just be like absolutely hilarious and no one else really seems to agree with me. I just happen to not find any of the jokes really that funny.
Sophie, be a dear and choke me out with this charging cord, would you?
Ooh, actually, can I use it? Because my phone's belly is hungry. She's all, feed me, mama.
I realized that screaming pain, cheering loud in my brain.
It felt a lot of the times like an 11-year-old or 12-year-old boy was trying to write the same humor from How I Met Your Mother, but instead it was either just like super cringy jokes that just did not land or just a bunch of really inappropriate sex jokes. There was one joke they made about Woody Harrelson in episode 4 that was just so haunting and horrible and disturbing that I don't even want to like repeat it with my own voice, but holy fuck, I just can't.
Actually, it's a little my fault. They say sex in the 3rd trimester can really move things along.
On the plus side, I got to see Woody Harrelson's penis from the inside.
Hey, he came early, too.
But I'm going straight ahead with this car.
And I know that it sounds like I'm being a prude by being like, oh, the jokes are too sexual and weird. It's not even that. It's like there's nothing clever about it. It's just like they're talking about dicks and masturbation and sex and things like that, but there's no nuance or anything funny about the punchline. It's just saying like, hey, boobs, am I right?
Is it like a sex thing? You won't believe how many times it is.
I don't know if it's because they're on Hulu instead of cable television and you can get away with saying a little bit more raunchy things. Like I know sometimes the characters say shit and swear a little bit more, but it just feels like it's trying so hard, especially with the sex jokes. It's like, Jesus Christ, just say something clever for once. There are times where the show does say things that are kind of funny and kind of actually clever and good, but it's most of those times where you feel like the show isn't trying way too hard to make you laugh. When they're just kind of settling down a little bit, not being quite as frantic with the way that they're trying to make you laugh, it actually does succeed in being funny and clever. I think in season 2, I'm hoping if they just kind of settle down a little bit, try not to be quite as manic and over the top and overcompensating with the humor, I think it could probably be a lot better. But it was for me personally, the humor was just incredibly off-putting. It just didn't work for me. Okay. it's time to talk about the characters now. I said it a few times on my channel, and I'll say it again here. Characters are the heart and soul of a sitcom. The sitcom cannot work if the characters do not work. After watching the first season, oh boy, do we have some work to do, because these characters were kind of rough. Now, let me be clear. I do think there is potential in this season with the characters. There are some characters that I already quite like, and I do think the writers have a few characters that they do demonstrate some effort towards developing. I also think the cast is generally pretty charismatic and fun, and in a lot of cases their performances really elevate these otherwise lacking characters as they're written. But on the whole, I struggle with the characters both individually and as a collective group of friends, and it makes it hard to invest in the series as a result. Now, yes, things can get better in season 2, and I even kind of count on them getting better in season 2. I do think even in this first season alone, the show does get a little bit better as it progresses with the characters, particularly because the chemistry between some of the people does kind of work as the show goes, but we still have a lot of work to do going forward. One of the general issues I have with the characters comes in the very first episode of the series. The pilot of this show was one of the worst episodes of the first season, and one of the reasons why was the way that it establishes the characters. Now, when we meet these characters, there isn't really an established friend group already. It's not like a How I Met Your Mother situation where Barney, Ted, Lily, and Marshall are already a group of friends and then Robin just kind of joins in independently. And I actually kind of like that. That's not really a problem for me because I like the idea of this season exploring the relationship between these people. You can make an entire season of these characters going from not really knowing each other to them by the end of the season kind of becoming friends and realizing that they can rely on each other. But the show instead doesn't really, do that. The show, on the one hand, makes the active decision to make the characters not friends at first, but then they also don't put the effort into showing us how they become friends. They just want to skip to the part where they're acting like they've known each other for years. And it kind of begs the question why they made this decision in the first place. Like, why couldn't they have just been a friend group from the start? Because it doesn't make you believe that they're friends, and it kind of taints the entire series for me. Think about the pilot. Sophie gets into an Uber with Jesse and Sid and immediately just starts dumping exposition about her relationship on them, and then they do the same with her. Because she grabs the wrong phone, she realizes she has to go back to Sid's bar to get her phone, and then she starts dumping more exposition about her relationship onto Jesse. Meanwhile, at that same bar, Valentina and Charlie are hiding under a bar, and then immediately Ellen spawns out of nowhere and just starts talking about her lettuce farm divorce because Charlie and Valentina are just kind of there to talk to her. And then because Sid and Sophie happen to need to go to the airport at the same time, all these people just go to the airport together, and then that's the bond that this whole relationship is established on, all because they existed within a physical proximity to one another, not because of a shared experience or connection. Now, it wouldn't bother me so much if this was like the start of how they met, but maybe then it takes the entire season for them to become friends. But then the show kind of skips that part, and then by the third episode, they're all hanging out and acting like they've been friends for years for no reason. And it just kind of puts a filter on the rest of the series that I have a hard time looking past. I think another problem with the characters in this series comes back to the fact that there are a lot of people to introduce and flesh out and not a lot of time to do it. You think about the time the classic sitcoms had each season to fully flesh out and explore their character dynamics, like 24 to 25 episodes per season, but this show only has about half that time and 6 to 7 people to introduce and develop. Kind of hard to do. It's not even that the show doesn't try to do that in some ways, because there are some efforts in some situations, but there's just not enough time to get to everyone, and the show tries to just constantly jump back and forth to make sure every character is involved in every episode, but then you just see them for like 2 minutes and you have these little fragments of moments, and it's really not enough to get to know them or connect with them or have them connect with each other on a deeper level. I think this problem could be fixed in season 2 by just giving us more time and more episodes to see these things flesh out, but after seeing just one season, it was really hard for me to feel truly connected to everyone. Now, Sophie is essentially the Ted Mosby equivalent of How I Met Your Father. She's the main character, she's the protagonist, she is the narrator that is telling the story, so everything is essentially told from Sophie's perspective. She is a photographer from Queens who, at the beginning of the first episode, decides that she is done dating after having been on 87 Tinder dates in the last year, and she has decided that she wants to find love. Now, so I think the writers understand that Sophie is an important character because they do try to put the most effort into developing her personality and her character out of all of the people in this series. There's one moment in season 1, episode 4 that I actually really like where Sophie's mom comes back, and we see that Sophie's mom is kind of a train wreck. She kind of just goes from relationship to relationship without caring about the consequences, and as a kid, Sophie would always kind of have to pick up the pieces whenever her mom was in a bad breakup. And as a result, that's kind of made Sophie a person that constantly feels like she has to fix people's problems. Kind of is also why Sophie is a hopeless romantic and kind of idealizes relationships and love so much throughout the season. And I like that we see that stuff with Sophie and that we understand why Sophie is the way that she is. It's really worthwhile to kind of understand why a character is the way that they are, rather than just seeing that they are like this. Other than those kinds of things, I was generally pretty annoyed with Sophie as a character throughout the entire first season, even though I will say Hilary Duff really seems to be putting her all into the character. I think one of the biggest problems with Sophie as a character is the fact that she has an uncanny similarity to Ted Mosby from How I Met Your Mother. Their character arc and their personalities and their goals in the beginning of the first season to the end of the first season are pretty identical to each other. Both start the season looking for love and believing that they found the one. They're hopeless romantics. They have a great first date with somebody in the first episode. They make an inappropriate romantic gesture that gets immediately rejected. They end up in a relationship with a very steady and conventionally compatible person, but ultimately that implodes because they want to pursue a relationship with somebody else, and that relationship implodes as well. So it's basically the same trajectory and the same character beats throughout the first season for these two people that are pretty identical and view the world and see the world and narrate their stories in very similar ways. And it's not to say that you can't have similarities between these two main characters, but it really just continues to make this show feel like a shadow of its former self rather than being something different. It would have been really interesting to see if Sophie was maybe like a relationship cynic. She doesn't want to be in a relationship. She's been burned too many times before, and then her friends kind of have to like pull her out of that and slowly get her to realize the love and excitement of being in a relationship with someone that you care about. Sophie is also kind of like Leia Foreman from That 90s Show, somebody who is kind of reduced down to one character quality, and they do so in such a manic and over-the-top way, whereas Leia from That 90s Show was like very awkward and over the top. Sophie is just, her one characteristic is just wanting to be in a relationship at all costs, and as a result everything she does just comes off as insane in order to pursue that goal. And it doesn't make her feel super relatable. It just makes her seem like she is just one note, one trajectory, and that is it. I also just kind of want to mention this here because I don't really know where else to talk about this, but oh my god, Sophie has some of the worst relationship prospects throughout the entire first season. The fact that she has to choose between Ian, Drew, and Jesse is just like, we have to do better. She does not have any chemistry with any of these people. We don't even get to know Ian well enough to know if they are compatible or not. You have Drew, who's played by Josh Peck, who we will talk about in a minute, and then Jesse, who is supposed to be the very stereotypical opposites attract. He's a cynic, she's a hopeless romantic, but they find their way together at some point in the season kind of relationship. And it just feels so dull and predictable. Sophie looks like legitimately disgusted with Jesse in every single scene that they're in together until the finale when they have to get together. All of the characters are like, oh my god, yes, Jesse and Sophie are finally together. Oh my god, we've been waiting for this the entire season. And I'm just like, why? They've shared like maybe 3 scenes together throughout the entire season, and every time Sophie looks like she could not want him to be farther away from her. I felt literally nothing when they got together and were finally like in a relationship, and then when they broke up, I felt nothing. Okay, now we need to talk about Jesse. So Jesse is a part-time music teacher, part-time Uber driver, part-time musician, part-time internet sensation, part-time sad, pitiful pile of mush. Jesse, at the beginning of the season, really annoyed me because he was just very clearly the guy that's like, oh, I hate relationships, I don't like relationships, it's pointless to be in love, blah, 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 blah.
Ooh, very you've got mail.
More like you've got unrealistic expectations for this date.
You've seen this story so many times. The people who are opposites attract, that shouldn't be together and don't see the world in the same way, find their way together, and now they're in a relationship. We know that it's going to happen, and it happens exactly in the way that you expect it to. It's just so painfully predictable and boring and annoying. And as soon as I saw Jesse's character, and as soon as the words started coming out of his mouth, I knew exactly what was going to happen. And it basically happened in the same exact way that I thought. But as the series progressed, I started to feel bad for Jesse. I started to get the sense that the writers hate Jesse. Every single storyline that they give this man is like Jesse in some sort of physical or emotional pain, or both. And it gets to a point where it's like, okay, we get it. This guy's life sucks. Let's give him a win or something for once. Jesse is known online as Proposal Fail Guy because he proposed to his girlfriend on stage during one of their concerts, and she broke up with him instead of accepting his proposal. He tries to make a move on Sophie or spend time with Sophie in the second episode, and she agrees to meet with him in one of the rooms in the club that they're at, and instead of doing that, she ditches him to go talk to another guy that she wants to date who's currently in Australia. He can't even get a professional photographer to take pictures of him for his Tinder profile that aren't creepy and weird. And then in that same episode, his vice principal boss not only makes fun of him to the girl that he likes, but then dates that girl and like openly hits on her and flirts with her right in front of him when he's standing there. And then in that same episode, he goes to a club with Sophie to try to like pick up girls, and the only girl that is interested in him just wants to have sex with him because he's proposal fail guy, and she wants to like joke about it with her friends after the fact. In episode 5, Jesse finally gets a relationship with a girl, but the girl is A, insufferable, and B, has already slept with his sister. His sister resents him because she feels like he abandoned her when they were kids. His car breaks down. He doesn't have benefits. His girlfriend who broke up with him when he tried to propose to her is now having this exciting music career without him. He gets locked out of his apartment on his balcony while wearing pigeon makeup on his face. I mean, this man cannot catch a fucking break. I do like the storyline where Jesse and his adoptive sister kind of talk about the fact that they want to reconnect, and it's kind of hard for them to reconnect because they spent so much time as kids apart from each other because their parents got divorced, and how she came to New York to kind of reconnect with him, and how they're trying to do that, but sometimes they're not always on the same wavelength. And I thought that was a really great direction for those characters because that's something that you can explore throughout an entire season. But unfortunately, it's something that's kind of like mentioned in that one scene, and then we don't get to see it again. And then throughout the rest of the season, they're just kind of apart. For 90% of the show, I felt bad for Jesse, but then I went back to hating him again in the finale when he tells Sophie that he loves her after knowing her for like 3 weeks and dating her for like 24 hours. And then when she was weirded out by that, kicks her out of his apartment, and then 5 minutes later is making out with his ex-girlfriend that's clearly manipulating him. So now we don't like Jesse anymore. I hope next season they give Jesse more to do. I really hope they explore his relationship with Ellen more because I feel like there's a lot there that could have been interesting to explore but just wasn't for some reason. If it doesn't make sense to have a relationship arc with Sophie, then I really hope that they just don't do it because it's not something that needs to be in the series. It's not something that needs to be forced between them. So Valentina is Sophie's best friend and roommate and also Charlie's girlfriend. At the beginning of the series, we find out that she works as some sort of like fashion stylist slash marketing person. I don't understand what her job does. Prior to the start of the pilot, she went to England for a business trip, met Charlie, fell in love. He ran off with her back to America and left his wealthy family behind to start a relationship with her. We don't really know much about Valentina in this season other than the fact that she has been friends with Sophie for a long time, I guess since college, and she is very sexual with every single thing that comes out of her mouth.
I am sex.
So for a lot of the season, that's basically her entire personality, is like how many people she's had sex with, being in a relationship, knowing what certain sex toys and things like that do. It's just like she is that person who's just very open about her sexuality. And I mean, that's totally fine. That's great. But it's like very just one note for her personality for a lot of this season. You don't really get to see a lot of depth for Valentina. And as a result, it's kind of annoying at times because you don't really feel like you get anything else out of her. Her relationship with Charlie is really Valentina's big arc. You know, they're trying to figure out different cultures and making this relationship work even though they don't really know each other that well. It's kind of hard to get to know who she is outside of that relationship. They do get a little bit better as the series progresses when they kind of like come to more of an understanding with each other outside of just like sleeping with each other constantly. I do like there's like a couple scenes where you see Valentina being a good friend to Sophie, like in the episode where Sophie's mom comes back. I like how protective Valentina is of Sophie, and you see that she is a good friend and she's looking out for her best interest. Next season, it's going to be interesting because Valentina and Charlie broke up at the end of the first season, and if they stay apart at the beginning of season 2, I think it'll be interesting for both of their characters. Other than that, I don't really have much to say. She seems fine. I don't know. Moving on. I think there's like 4 or 5 things I could say about Sid. Is engaged. He owns a bar. He shoved a Lego up his butt when he was a kid. What else do I know about Sid? Oh, and he's friends with Jesse, I guess, so I guess that counts. I don't have much to say about Sid because the show really doesn't give you much to know about Sid. Sid is a bar owner who lives with Jesse. He's best friends with Jesse. He has a girlfriend slash fiance that has a residency in California, and so he's in a long-distance relationship for the majority of the season. A lot of his storylines kind of revolve around him and his girlfriend slash fiance being on opposite ends of the country and how that kind of causes difficulties for them in their relationship. You don't really get a good sense of what Sid is like or who he is as a character in this show, because a lot of his storylines, like I said, either revolve around a relationship with a character that we as an audience don't know and therefore aren't very invested in, or he's just kind of like the supporting character that is there to like make commentary about things that the other people are doing in more important storyline. It's kind of a shame because I do think that the actor that plays Sid has good comedic timing and he has a good presence on screen. I didn't necessarily expect him and his girlfriend to actually get married at the end of the first season because they kept making it seem like they were going to break up, so I was kind of surprised to see that they did get married, even though she has a residency for another year in California, so that means that they're going to be apart for another year, even though they're now married. Hoping that they actually wouldn't stay together because I wanted to see what Sid was like outside of this relationship and kind of give him more storylines outside of long distance is hard and I don't like this. But I'm hoping in season 2 maybe we'll get to see more of him and his fiance slash wife actually together so we can feel a little bit more invested in their relationship as a whole. Here's the thing, I kind of love Charlie. I know that might be an unpopular opinion because I've seen people online say that they think he's really annoying. I don't really care. I think Charlie's fun. Charlie is Valentina's boyfriend who left a very affluent family in England to follow this relationship with Valentina in America. He is going through like complete culture shock throughout the majority of the season. He's never really been to New York City before or experienced life not outside of this bubble of like rich, wealthy people. His experiences in New York City are pretty much like new experiences every single episode, and he's just constantly trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I think Charlie is very endearing, even though his storyline is very typical of a fish out of water. I don't know how to like use a subway, things kind of like that, but I think the way that the actor performs this role makes him very charming and fun. Charlie's relationship with Valentina can be a little bit annoying at times, but you kind of see as a relationship grows and develops that they do have real conversations with each other about their differences and similarities and trying to make their relationship work. I also like the moments where Charlie kind of talks about his experience growing up in a very rich family. He talks about how he doesn't want kids because his mom was so distant and cold with him to the point where he just never wants to put his kid through that, even if he knows he would be a different type of parent. He also mentions having gone through therapy because his family was very neglectful and disapproving of everything that he did as a kid, which I think kind of gives some perspective into how Charlie operates and like why his personality is the way that he is, because he's very like excitable, enthusiastic, and like trying to be perfect at all times. I also really love his relationship with Ellen, his friendship with her, because they eventually become roommates. I like the fact that they're both trying to experience living in New York for the first time, coming from very different areas of the country or the world that are very different from New York, and trying to just figure it out together. They don't really get a lot of time together though. I think in season 2 they'll hopefully give more time to Charlie and Ellen kind of navigating New York City and figuring out what's going on. But I think it'll be good for both Charlie and Valentina to not be together at the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2, because I think it'll allow their character individually to grow a little bit, even if they end up getting back together at some point. Although it does kind of make me wonder why Charlie would even stay in New York City, because he just came to New York to follow his girlfriend that he's no longer with, so he could probably just go back to his family. Okay, let's talk about Ellen. I don't think the writers really like Ellen that much, but I like Ellen, even if the writers don't seem to. On the one hand, I do like Ellen's arc. I like the idea of being this person who just got divorced and is wanting to start a new career and get a new lease on life and develop this new bond with her brother that was kind of abandoned in their childhood, and they kind of became estranged for a little while. I think these are all great things that you can explore for Ellen in this series. But the show doesn't really do that. Ellen is basically reduced down to like comic relief of just making her the most unbearably awkward and over-the-top person in the world. She doesn't even seem like a real person most of the time. She's just kind of saying wacky things for other people to like kind of laugh at, and then they go off on their own main storylines and Ellen's just kind of there. Like I mentioned with Jessie, I like this dynamic of these two characters that kind of had a falling out when they were in their teenage years or late 20s or whatever, but they're trying to reconnect as brother and sister once again. And we see them have this conversation about it in like the 3rd or 4th episode, and it's really great, but then we don't really get to see it revisited at all for the rest of the series. They don't really even share scenes together, Jessie and Ellen. It's just kind of that one moment and then that's it. I hope it's something that we see in season 2. I also hope we get to see her have more scenes with Charlie and them trying to navigate New York City together, because I think that's all great. But really, Ellen is just kind of like shamelessly pushed to the side for a lot of the first season, and it's really obnoxious, and I really hope that they don't do that in the next season. So let's talk a little bit about some of the supporting characters in this series. One of the main supporting characters in the show is Drew, who plays Sophie's love interest. He's a vice principal at the school that Jesse works at. Drew kind of reminds me a lot of like what Victoria was to Ted in season 1 of How I Met Your Mother. This person that on the surface just seems absolutely perfect and great for all intents and purposes, just conventionally ideal for the protagonist. I also am just not a huge fan of Josh Peck for some reason. I loved him in Drake and Josh, but I think just the fact that he spends so much time with David Dobrik now, it just makes me think of him as like a cocky little asshole as well. Whenever he should be emoting certain emotions in a particular scene, he's just like mugging because he thinks he's so fucking attractive, and it's just annoying to me. I don't really think he had a lot of chemistry with Sophie, so I wasn't super broken up about the fact that she dumped his ass at the end of season 1, but I'm sure he'll probably make returning appearances in season 2. So Ian was the character that Sophie was looking to date in season 1, episode 1. It was the guy that she met on Tinder that she was convinced was going to be like the new love of her life or her new future father of her child. He might be, we don't know yet, but we'll have to see. And we don't really get to know much about Ian other than the things that Sophie kind of dumps in exposition to us in the beginning of the first episode. Unlike the relationship with Ted and Robin, where you actually get to see their first date and see the chemistry develop between them throughout the first episode, we're just kind of told that Ian is perfect for Sophie, and we just keep kind of like getting that narration jammed down our throat. We don't actually get to see it play out in real time. So as a result, the fact that he goes to Australia to go on a marine biology trip or whatever he's doing doesn't really have that much impact on me. Like, I don't feel sad about it or feel sad for Sophie because I'm not really invested in their relationship or anything that's happening on screen. But then when I saw that he came back at the end of season 1, I also didn't really care. I was like, oh, okay, Ian's back. Cool. I'm sure in season 2, once we actually get to see scenes with him, we'll probably get to know him a little bit more and maybe feel a little bit more emotionally invested. But the fact that I don't really know him at all and he spent maybe about 4 minutes on screen throughout this entire first season, I don't really have much to say about him. Meredith is the character that made Jesse essentially an internet sensation. He was dating her prior to the events of the first season. At one point, they were in a band together, and then during one of their sets, he got down on one knee and proposed to her, to which she said no. That's how he became Proposal Fail Guy. Now, at various points throughout this season, Sid and Ellen keep mentioning that Meredith is like evil. They just seem to hate her because she said no to something that Jesse chose to do and chose to propose to her in public in the middle of one of their concerts. She has the right to say no. So the fact that they seem to hate her for that alone kind of confused me, because I'm like, what would you have wanted her to do? You could want to be in a relationship with somebody, but if they propose to you, that might be too much for them. Well, once we actually get to see her at the end of season 1, we see that she actually has had a very successful music career without Jesse, and that she's wanting to kind of get back together with him because she wants to go on tour with him. I started getting a little suspicious, and I'm starting to now get the vibes that she's probably manipulating him. I don't think Meredith is a good person. Let me be clear on that. I don't think the reasons why Sid and Ellen hate her are valid. Like, yes, she is manipulative, but they don't dislike her because she's manipulative. They dislike her because they said no to their friend. I know that's very complicated and convoluted, but that's just where I'm standing with this. So I guess too, we should probably talk about Hannah, because Hannah is Sid's girlfriend slash fiance that is in a surgical residency in California and is in this long distance relationship with Sid. You know, Hannah, we don't really get to see much of her. We hear about her quite a lot, and when we do see her, she's just kind of stressed out all the time because she's in this long distance relationship and trying to plan a wedding. We don't really know much about her other than that, though. I mean, we don't really get a sense of her personality or her chemistry with Sid. It just seems like they're always bickering, and I guess maybe that's because they're in the long distance relationship, but there's no real chemistry or banter that we get to see about them that would make us feel invested in the relationship. She seems fine. I hope they can like figure out an interesting thing to do with her character other than just be Sid's wife. So in my That 90s Show video, I talked a lot about how the show's biggest issue was nostalgia. Although it was fun to see the things you knew and the people you love in their respective roles again, it was ultimately just distracting and didn't help the plot of the new characters at all. But in the case of That 70s Show and That 90s Show, these two shows not only existed in the same universe as one another, but they actually overlap in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that you may expect and find to be totally logical and even necessary to appear from That 70s Show in its new series because of how the spin-off was structured. weird. Leia is the daughter of 2 main characters from that 70s show and the granddaughter of 3 other main characters, staying in the same city and in the same house, so it makes sense to have some of these things revisited because it's not just nostalgia, it's continuity. The only problem came with that 90s show when the show went completely overboard and just threw everything but the kitchen sink into the series to desperately make people like it. With How I Met Your Mother, we really don't have the same circumstances that require all of these references to the original source material. We find out early on in the series that yes, these shows take place in the same universe, but there's no real overlap for the stories really. Sophie isn't, for example, related to anyone in the prior cast. There's no connection of any sort. The stories don't take place at the same time. They just happen to both take place in New York City, aka a massive city where the probability of these two storylines intersecting is slim to none. In other words, having references to How I Met Your Mother in this show doesn't really make as much sense. Can't really excuse the inclusion of these things by maintaining continuity like you could with that 90s show. There's literally no logical reason for it. Now, does that mean we can't invent a creative and interesting way to incorporate those elements into this new series? No, that doesn't mean we can't do that, but it has to make sense. That's what I said with that 90s show. Nostalgia can be good, but it has to make sense. And it can't detract from the main point of the story. But of course, well, you know, the show doesn't really do that. There were 3 main references to How I Met Your Mother in this series that really just stuck out to me, each more empty and frustrating than the last. The first was the fact that Sid and Jesse lived in the same apartment unit as Ted and Marshall from How I Met Your Mother. The show explains that this massive coincidence by saying that Jesse and Sid went to Wesleyan just like Ted, Marshall, and Lily, and that 2 alums posted this apartment unit on the alumni website. And I know it's just an apartment building, but it also feels insanely transparent and kind of desperate that the writer decided to include this. It just kind of feels lazy and exists for no other reason than to reference something that you already know. I don't know if the writers just thought that this would create a positive association between something that you know and like and these new characters in the series, but for me, all it did was just kind of remind me that the previous series was better and funnier and more successful than this one, and that this series doesn't live up to the expectations of its predecessor. The other major references to the original series came in the season finale. The first was the return of the captain, who was a reoccurring character in season 8 of How I Met Your Mother. He was an eccentric rich guy that at one point hired Lily to serve as an art collector for him, and he had a particular fascination with boats. Now, I don't love this character, but I guess he was kind of memorable at some points in the series, so it was a little jarring to have this man come back in How I Met Your Father for the absolutely dumbest reason ever. In the finale, the narration keeps jumping back and forth between the main story and this completely unrelated story about the captain cheating on his wife and getting a divorce, and during the divorce proceedings, she gets possession of his boats and decides to decommission all of them out of spite for the fact that he cheated on her. All of these decommissioned boats will also include one that are on marine biology voyages off the coast of Australia, and if you haven't put this together at this point, that means that Ian, the guy that Sophie dated in the first episode, will be returning as a result. Now, I think the show thought this was a really funny, clever little bit that would explain a cliffhanger for the next season, but to me, this just kind of pissed me off. I know How I Met Your Mother did a lot of funny, quirky, outlandish storylines that explained things like this, but it wasn't actually funny or quirky in this situation. It just didn't make any fucking sense, and it felt like it was a waste of time. As it was, there was a lot going on with the characters in the finale, and the show just kind of took away time from that could have been better spent establishing those things to detract with this very convoluted story to explain one plot point. We also see in the season 1 finale the return of Robin Scherbatsky, who was sitting at the bar at McLaren's when Sophie randomly walks in and they start talking about relationship. Now, yes, Colby Smulders is great as Robin, and she was great in this series, and it's awesome to see her in this role again, but it's also insanely unnecessary and distracting because you know she's just there to pander to fans in the old series. There's nothing really creative about her involvement or why she appeared in the plot. She just happened to be sitting at the bar that Sophie walked into. It would have been better if they kind of did something creative to make Sophie maybe like a photographer for a project that Robin was working on for work, and then maybe Sophie is just breaking down from the stress of her relationships and Robin has to reluctantly comfort her and they talk about this. There's nothing creative like that. It's just they happen to exist in the same room as each other and then they just start talking about relationships. It just felt so cheap and lazy and pointless and unnecessary. But I don't really think I would mind all of these really unnecessary and random references to things if the show itself was a little bit stronger and the characters were a little bit stronger. The show itself is just so predictable and basically a conglomerate conglomeration of all the things we've seen before from other sitcoms or this particular sitcom preceding How I Met Your Father. So when you do see things like this, you can't help but wonder, what if they spent that time and energy referencing all of these old things, actually making something better about this show, making it feel new and different? What if they took that energy and better spent it elsewhere? Because otherwise, what's the point of making this show? Is it just a vessel to do the same shit all over again, but less funny and less entertaining? You tell me. So do I recommend How I Met Your Father? It's kind of hard to give a recommendation just based on the first season because I know that there are going to be more episodes coming out and that could very much change my opinion on whether or not the season is good or whether I recommend it. But if we're just strictly looking at the 10 episodes that I talked about in this review, probably not. I can understand from a certain perspective, for a very specific purpose, why this show might appeal to some people. Sometimes you just want to watch television that doesn't really make you think or challenge you very much, like a comfort show that you just want to throw on and it's just familiar and you've seen it before and it's fluffy. I think I used that word to describe that 90s show in my other video. And this is very much that kind of genre. And sometimes that's okay. I do think there are a lot of problems in like the humor for me personally. I just didn't find it funny at all. I think a lot of the characters are very predictable and not very well written. And I think even if you're still having a fluffy television series that doesn't really make you think or it's not very, very groundbreaking, you can still have well-developed characters or well-written characters that are a little bit more than just one-dimensional shadows of things you've seen before. I'm trying to think of whether I would prefer this or season 1 of that 90s show, and I'm having a hard time trying to figure that out. Both were kind of difficult for me to get through for the same reasons, but I do see similar types of potential for both of the first seasons. I guess with How I Met Your Father, the acting performances are a little bit better and a little bit more convincing. I did see a little bit more chemistry develop with the characters as the series progressed. I also think the show made me laugh a little bit more than that 90s show. I have heard rumors that there will be a lot of guest appearances from original characters from How I Met Your Mother in season 2. I don't know how true that is. I've been trying to not see any of that stuff because I want to be genuinely surprised when I watch season 2, so I don't know if that's true. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know down in the comments what you think of How I Met Your Father. Do you think season 1 was better or worse than that 90s show, and do you think season 2 will be any better? Do you enjoy season 2 so far? Are there any other shows or videos or movies that you want me to talk about? Because I am more than happy to take any suggestions that you guys might have. In the meantime, I'm going to go check on my drugged cat because otherwise she will probably drool on me in my sleep. Bye-bye.